the BCS and the college football playoff. Two distinct eras. When we were in one, most of us claimed that we wanted the other, and now the more and more we've gotten into the other, I'll be darned if a couple of us, maybe even 3, maybe 5, maybe even, 30% are looking back saying, things weren't so bad during the BCS. Now, there's certainly merit to the college football playoff. So let's dive into this, because I think in a lot of ways we're at an inflection point in college football. Now, there are a lot of different conversations going on simultaneous, so we don't even have time just on this show or a collection of these shows to address every single one of them. But I think a lot of us can agree on a few things, even if we disagree on the answers. The inflection point that is here, and I think it's been here for a little while now in college football, is this confluence of a whole bunch of things that we don't like. I don't think any of us look at the deterioration of bowl season and it mattering less and less and say, oh, that's a good thing. We're happy about that. I don't think any of us, as pure college football fans, are looking at a bunch of guys opting out of bowl games and saying, oh, man, I love that. I don't think any of us are looking at the increasing regionality of college football and saying, oh, I love that. Man, I love when 70% of the country doesn't matter. No one likes that. Where we differ is what we think the solution or the solutions should be. So I want to talk about the problems a little bit tonight, and maybe the genesis of some of those problems being from a different kind of well than maybe a lot of people think it's from. Lately, I've been asking myself a question I thought I'd never ask myself. And I remember vividly, before I give you the question, when there were rumors about the college football playoff. It was for a long time. I mean, people were talking about a playoff for a long time, but when it finally started to sound like it was really possible was like 2011, 12. I mean, that's when it came around eventually, and I was so excited. A lot of other people were excited because I was just envisioning the stretch run of college football. The regular season was still going to matter a whole lot, but the stretch run, that November when you have those consequential bowl games, not only are you going to have Ohio State, Michigan, or the Iron Bowl, or Florida and Florida State, but those games are then going to have an added layer of consequence when it comes to the playoff. And it was going to be great, and that selection Sunday was going to be like nothing that college football had seen before. And that was to some degree true. But now we're several years into the college football playoff. And it started in 2014, and now we're entering 2021. And I think I put out something the other day on Twitter that I think is a minority opinion, but I said I think it'll be a majority opinion in 2030. And this should be caveated, if we expand the playoff. I'm against it, you know that. My opinion's been well chronicled. But if we end up expanding this playoff, I believe that there's going to be a time down the road where more people are looking back and saying, in retrospect, that BCS era, that era I had so many problems with when we were in it, as it turns out, it was healthier for college football than this expanded playoff. Now, a lot of you would never envision yourself saying that right now, just like I never envisioned myself in 2007 or 8 or 9 saying, if we ever have a playoff, I'll probably end up liking it less than the BCS. I never thought I'd say that. I didn't have the intuition. I didn't have the vision. I couldn't see around college football's corner. But yet I'm close to it right now for different reasons. Now, it's not all the playoffs' fault, so we're going to dive into this. We're going to go 50,000 feet here for just a second, because what I care about, as it turns out, was taken care of in the BCS era. It certainly wasn't perfect. By no means was the BCS era perfect. You could nitpick as to whether the AP had too much power or computers had too much power, whether 2 teams was enough. We can nitpick all that. We could talk about that. We always did back then. But I want you to think about, if you agree with me, now if you don't agree with me, it's a different discussion, but if you agree that these things matter, these things were being served well. Like rivalry games being paramount, that was still being served. They still mattered. They had a history and a life of their own back then, I think much more so, and crystallized back then much more so than they are right now in this current era. The regular season was absolutely paramount back then. There was no safety net under anyone. It was do or die virtually every week. Urgency every week, unique unto any other sport in the American landscape. Bowl season was awesome because we had the BCS, but yet teams that weren't making the national championship game were still jacked to go play in one of the BCS games or the Capital One Bowl or the Gator Bowl or the Meineke Car Care Bowl. It all mattered. Well, what in the world happened? So we fast forward now, like how could it be that just adding a playoff, so we added, 2 more teams? The grand total went from 2 to 4. How could it be that the playoff eroded away at a lot of this? Well, I don't think it was just the playoff. I have Spoken about this before, but I want to dive into it a little bit more tonight. Because, see, the title game still matters, so we didn't lose any value on the title game. Everyone watched the BCS title game, but yet all that other stuff mattered too. So if we were to expand this thing to 8 versus that's kind of the question I'm asking. Which environment would be healthier for college football? It's my opinion that this sport saw the slow erosion begin to its overall product when the value of the nucleus and the definition of the nucleus of this sport started shifting from regular season to postseason. Now, in, again, retrospect, it wasn't quite evident at the time, when you had the hub of college football, which is ESPN, when you had the hub of college football able to purchase that college football playoff contract, it's a no-brainer. They did what you and I would do if we ran the marketing department at ESPN. I mean, we'd put all of our dollars and cents behind marketing that product we just spent untold billions of dollars on. That was a no-brainer. The problem is it came at the expense of something. You can't just put that machine behind one thing and not have it come at the expense of another thing. Slowly but surely, as we shifted the nucleus of college football from regular season to postseason, a funny thing happened. People started to pay attention. Not just you and I. Players started to pay attention. And so games that used to matter didn't quite matter as much anymore. More emphasis on one thing removes emphasis from another thing. And it took a while for people to realize that this was happening, but yet it was happening. And so I'm listening to some folks talk, and I've heard it at the sort of ground level a lot, but I have not really heard many national voices speak this way. I got to credit Kirk Herbstreit. I was listening to Kirk Herbstreit the other day talk about this, and it's probably the biggest voice to date that I have heard really be willing to look in the mirror and call himself out a little bit, maybe call his employer out a little bit, but just also call into account the entire Tier 1 college football media ecosystem, which bears a lot of responsibility, whether you like it or not, whether they admit it or not, to shaping that nasty word that we don't like to use, narrative, to shaping that narrative of college football. Ultimately, what the big boys and big girls talk about, what the big networks talk about, what they show you, what they put in front of you, that sets the tone. That sets the conversation piece, and that defines what the focus is going to be on this sport. And I'm listening to Kirk Herbstreit the other day, I believe on the Letterman Roast podcast, and he said, listen, somewhere along the way, we allowed the definition of what college football is to shift from regular season to postseason. We got to put the brakes on that, and we got to throw it in reverse, and we got to get back to the fact that, hey, Iowa versus Iowa State, that stuff matters. Independent of whether both teams are going to go on to finish no better than 8-4, that rivalry game matters. Like the Gator Bowl, it matters. It's a big deal to make that bowl game. It used to be that way. It is rapidly deteriorating into something that you don't really recognize as the college football that you grew up on, that even I grew up on. And so what's the answer here? It's not too late. By no means is it too late to do anything about this. I wouldn't be talking about it if it was too late. I'm going to tell you what I don't think the answer is. I don't think the answer is more playoff. Now, some people do. Some people would tell you if you want to make the regular season matter more, then expand to 8 teams. And here's the caveat that a lot of you add in that I just fundamentally disagree with, you've got to give an auto bid to every conference champion. Why? Because that means every conference championship race matters, every conference title game matters, and to a certain degree, you're right. Okay, you're kind of penny wise, pound foolish, in my opinion, in your thinking there, but you are technically right. Every conference championship game would matter, but what is it coming at the expense of? Because what I'm valuing, what I care about the most in this sport is the regular season. I think it's the most precious commodity that this sport has. And I'm telling you unequivocally, you cannot expand this playoff. You cannot give more seats at the table and still maintain the urgency and the value and the no safety net aspect under the regular season. You can't do that. That's impossible. You can have one or you can have the other. You can't have both. What I'm asking you to do for just a second is to remove every preconceived notion you have. And just sit back for a second in a dark room at night, just stare at your ceiling and just ask yourself, should the postseason and getting it right in the postseason, should that really be how we define whether we've got a healthy sport or not? Because it wasn't too long ago, the postseason, like in the national championship, it mattered. But man, like the regionality, who was going to win the Pac-12, who played in the Rose Bowl, who's going to win the SEC championship game, all that stuff mattered. Like it was treated every bit as big as, all right, we're going to have a national championship too, and that's going to be nice. Someone's going to get crowned national championship. But it wasn't like, all right, well, Louisville, they've already lost 2 games early in the season. They're out of it. Screw Louisville. Like, we're not going to talk about them the rest of the year. How in the world is that healthy? So My answer is not, well, just tell Louisville to win the conference championship. That means technically they're still alive. No, it doesn't. You know that as well as I do. I'm just envisioning a product that morphs into something so razor focused on the last lap that it ignores the first 7 laps, when the first 7 laps, the regular season, is its core product and it loses itself. I have spoken at great length about how, like, I used to love watching NASCAR when I grew up. And I used to love watching those races at places like Darlington, for example. And then all of a sudden, the Darlington race was gone. And they're racing in Kansas and Chicago, and that's great. That's wonderful. Try and expand the sport. It's kind of like watching the NHL come into Atlanta and come into these southern markets, and it's like, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to shoehorn your way into? Understand where your core is. Understand your identity. Just because a consultant walked in a room one day and said, this is the way it's got to be. No, it's not the way it's got to be. You know who you are. Look in the mirror. College football, we used to know what college football was. Now, I'm not sure. You get 10 different answers from 10 different people. College football is at its best when the regular season is the nucleus of the sport. I'm not so sure. In fact, I'm sure the other way, expanding, is not the way to go to achieve that. Unfortunately, we'll probably have to learn it the hard way, though.